Hello, I'm Martha Glennie, jewelry professor at George Brown College in Toronto. My videos look at different jewelry forms, items. I'm offering tips, tools, and suggestions that work for me. The form we're looking at in this video is this simple convex curve. I'm showing you this one because this is the simplest polishing situation. So if you can bring this lovely brass surface to a mirror finish, that's a good start to going on to taking on more challenging forms. Now, the thing you have to realize is good polishing begins at the bench. So let's turn to the bench and get going. The first thing we need to do when we look at our oval surface is, as I said, prepare it properly for polishing. And really that means we have to see it. So you want to get your loop out, have a good look at the surface, have a good look at the edge to see what you need to do. This edge shows shear marks from the forming, and so we're going to tackle that first with our hand file. But the top surface, as I've looked with my loop, is really pretty good. We don't need to file that surface because you never want to do more work than you have to. So I always do the edge first. That's my first tip. I always do the edge first so I don't forget. And it also gives me a good indication of the metal thickness. So you can see I have my bench pin. My bench pin is my best friend. And I'm going to support my hand on the bench pin. Oh, whoops. You know what? I can't see what I'm doing. I have to get my glasses on. There we go. That looks better. Okay. So I'm going to take my fine hand file, and my file stroke, my file only cuts in the forward action, okay, we remember that. And I'm taking it away each time so I can see what I've done. There we go. Now, can you notice that my file stroke is following the curve of the object? That's very important. If I do short little straight strokes, I'm actually making facets. We don't want to change our form. So around we go. Just once probably will be enough. And I'm almost there. There we go. Now, what do you think my next step is? Yes, you're right. You have to get your loop out and have a good look and make sure that you've removed all those marks. And then the next step, as we refine the surface, is to go to your sanding stick. An invaluable tool in preparing an object for polishing. Now, as I go, what am I doing? Yes, I'm actually sanding in that lovely curved stroke, which exactly follows the form. And you can see, although I'm not supporting the object on the bench pin, I am supporting my hand on the bench pin. We want to make all our work efficient. And the one thing that you never ever do is this, air sanding, I call it. Most of your work dissipates because as soon as you press on here, your hand moves. So always use your bench peg, support, have the object turn to you so that you can see it. And you know what one of the most important things is? You have to have continuous looking. And then not only just looking where you're finishing, but seeing. Have the light in a good place so that you can use the light reflections to help you see the surface. Now that looks pretty good with my eyes, but I'm going to check it with my loop before I go ahead. And it's gotten a little sharp on this underside, so I'm just quickly going to take my sanding stick and just break off that little bit of a sharp edge. Now after I've checked it with my loop, I'm going to go to a little bit finer sanding stick and I just go over the edge again. And then that's all done, and I don't have to think about it anymore. It's all ready for polishing there. So the next area I want to look at is my surface. So as I inspect my surface, I see that this object from the manufacturing process has lines that are just going this way. So I'm going to start my sanding in this direction, because as I go across these lines, I can see when they are removed. So I told you that my first tip was to do the edge first. And now here's a second tip for you as I continue sanding. With something like this where the metal is fairly thin, I'm going to sand the surface, but I'm going to avoid doing the very edge here until the end. Okay? Can you think of why that might be? Take a second while I sand and think about it. Okay, is that a second? Have you come up with an answer? Well, the answer for me is that you don't want to go over that edge and over that edge and over that edge, because what's going to happen? Your metal's going to get thinner and thinner and thinner. So that's why I avoid the edge until I've done the whole surface, and the surface looks good. I'm almost there. You see, it really doesn't take very long to do a good first sanding with these brass forms. There. Now, to do the edge, I'm going to follow the form around and around like this. And that way I don't change the outline of the form. As I'm coming around here, I can see that some of those manufacturing marks from the shear are on the surface. So I'm going to have to pay particular attention. Yes, I need to sand it, and yes, it's going to get a little thinner, but I don't want it to go any thinner than it has to. There we go. That's doing well. Now I'm going to use my light. My light is a big helper. I can see some lines going across this way. So I'll go back over there. Even though this isn't a reflective surface, because it's metal, it does have reflections. And you can use those to make sure that there's no marks in the surface. So all the time I'm doing this, I'm inspecting the surface. And we're almost all the way around. Let's have a look. That looks pretty good. My next step, I bet you can guess, because it's the same as here. I'm going to take my finer sandpaper, and in this case, because I can do it and it is helpful, I'm going to go across the form this way. I'm going to avoid the edge in the same way. Go across the form, at the end come around the form. Now there you have to follow your sanding lines, but that's okay. You just have to really pay attention and make sure that you are completely removing the coarser lines and replacing them with the finer lines. Because that, after all, that's what polishing is, finishing, right? We just are replacing lines with other finer lines. So after the whole surface is done, it's going to look like this. And then I've got my edge, I've got my surface, and we're all ready to go to the polishing lathe. Here's our beautifully sanded oval, ready for polishing. Now I've already got the wheel going, and I'm going to be using Tripoli. My Tripoli is right here handy, because this is a Tripoli buff. So I don't mix compounds. If you want to use Gray Star, have a Gray Star wheel buff, okay? I want to identify how do my lines go, And before I add any compound, I want to test my wheel buff. So let's get right in there and do it. Now I need some compound on there. I can see it's not doing much. And I want you, I'm going to just do a little polishing and then I've got a question for you. Okay, so here's my question. How would you describe the movement that I'm doing? Okay, I'm moving the piece all the time and I'm changing the orientation all the time. Every time I come to the wheel buff, I'm moving it and I'm changing the orientation. Now here's a tip to preserve your fingers. When the metal is thin, don't put your finger right behind where you're polishing because it gets hot. I'm holding it at the edge. And the other thing I'm doing is I'm holding it in a pinch grip, okay? And that means either I'm putting my thumb above and my finger behind, or a little more comfortable is your finger on top and your thumb underneath, because that way I can tip the piece down. If I do it this way, it's really awkward. I can't really have much maneuverability. So let's do this. Why is a pinch grip important? Well, a pinch grip is important because if the piece catches, it's going to just come out of your hand and it's not going to drag your hand into the wheel buff, okay? And I tend to hold it with one hand and support it with the other, because if I get going like this, I don't have much maneuverability and it feels secure, but I just can't get in there and do the kind of polishing action that I want to. So there we go. I'm being careful to put it to the wheel buff, take it away from the wheel buff. I'm keeping it moving, and I take it away from the wheel buff fairly often because two reasons. I need to inspect it, and it gets hot. So if you take it away and do your inspection, in that time the piece should cool off enough that you can then come back to the wheel buff and work on it. Now there was a little place there that needed a little extra work. That's why I put compound on. But this half is looking really good. Now I can turn it around when it's cooled off a bit and hold it in this direction and complete my surface. Now, something that's important to remember is that while polishing using Tripoli or Gray Star makes a reflective surface, it isn't a surface without lines. You're replacing the sanding lines with the finer polishing lines. That's what we're doing here. After the whole surface you've gone over is well done, remember, we should have done our edge first so we don't forget. And the edge is a little bit tricky. Right now I have the piece that's completely parallel to the wheel buff, and if I try to polish my edge that way, it's actually going to go in between the fabric that makes up the wheel buff. So I want to just turn it a little bit that way, okay? This would be a bad idea. Can you think why? Right, it's going to catch and pull out of my hands. So I just turn it just off of vertical and I just go around. You don't have to press quite as hard when we do this edge. It's a tiny little surface. It's not like our big surfaces. And of course, doing it this way on this angle, if that feels more comfortable, that would be fine. And go all the way around, have a good inspection, and then we're going to say that our polishing is done. This oval is sanded on the left side and polished with Tripoli on the right side. The right side is reflective. In fact, you can see me taking the photo in the reflection. If you look at the surface, however, instead of the reflection, especially right above the camera, you can see triply lines. A well-polished surface will be reflective and show triply lines. To go ahead to buffing, so we're separating our polishing into two activities. So polishing kind of is used as a generic word, but it can be broken down into polishing, which is using our coarser compounds, and buffing, which is using our rouges. Before we can do that, however, we want to wash our piece carefully. And that's because we don't want to contaminate our rouge wheel buff with the triply compound. So I happen to have, oh, look at that. Whoops, that's the wrong one. So I happen to have a polished oval all done right here, ready to do the rouge. It's been washed, it's ready to go. And our rouge activity is a little bit different than the buffing activity. And we're using a softer buff because we're trying to create a finer surface. So in point of fact, you might have two rouge wheel buffs that you use. One that's a harder one. See, this one's quite soft, right? And you might have one that's harder that you use and then one that's softer. The softer and the less compound you use, the finer the finish. And then, secondly, everything else is the same. We use a pinch grip, we support our work, we use this portion of the wheel, but particularly with brass, we found a sort of hit and run technique works quite well. That's what I call it, hit and run, or rather I took that over from one of my colleagues. And that works for brass, but not necessarily for other materials. So every metal is going to have its own particular little characteristics. What we're looking to do is replace the triply lines with rouge lines and then refine those rouge lines until they're gone. So let's go. And again, I'm going to try my buff first before I add any compound. Now you can see I'm pressing pretty hard, aren't I? I'm not doing this. If I do this, look, I'm not sure you can see it, but compound is sticking to my piece. It's coming off here and sticking to here. I don't want to keep buffing with that on there, so I'm going to add a little bit of that, a little bit of compound, and then I'm going to do this kind of sliding across, and that's going to take the compound off. And every time I do this hit and run, what am I doing again? I'm changing the orientation of the piece to the wheel buff. There's all kinds of polishing flaws that can come up, and we're going to talk about those in another video. And just right now I'm focusing, you see, I'm doing a little bit of hit and run, and I'm also sliding it across. I maybe need a little more compound on at this point. And because you're pressing hard, the metal does get hot. There we go. Here is our oval, polished on the right side with triply, and polished and buffed with red rouge on the left side. Notice that the reflection of me taking the photo is clearer on the left. And look at the buffed surface above the camera reflection, and you will see that the surface is without lines, unlike the right side that shows triply lines. Your goal is a smooth, even surface without lines or flaws that is highly reflective, a mirror finish. That's our action. That's what you do. And if your piece is well polished, the buffing should only take a couple of minutes, okay? So sanding will take longer, then polishing should take a shorter period of time for sure, and then buffing really a minute with this kind of form. So that gives you a gauge. When we're finished here, we're going to turn off our lathe. We're going to wash our piece, have a good inspection. We're going to carefully dry it, okay? If I took see how my fingers have compound on? If I took those and rubbed those hard against the surface, I'd be making tiny little surface scratches. And it's the same with the cloth that you're using to dry your work. My best tip here is to take an old ratty t-shirt, a cotton t-shirt, and cut it up and use that for your lovely clean, and then just pat your work dry, and there you have a beautiful, beautiful mirror. Hello, Martha. That's it for today.